Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My good friend Dr. Emily Thelen joins us today to talk about some of the most beautifully produced manuscripts of early music ever made, those of Petrus Alamire. Dr. Thelen worked extensively on these manuscripts following her doctoral studies in musicology at Princeton. She currently serves as the executive director for mission integration at St. Norbert's College in De Pere, Wisconsin, and also serves on our editorial team for the Church Music Association of America's journal, Sacred Music. On to the interview. Emily, I have the privilege of working with you on Sacred Music Journal, and that is a lot of fun to work with you here, but I'm even more delighted to have you here with me finally on a podcast. It's been too long, and I should have invited you on a long time ago, but thanks for finally joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about a very interesting collection of manuscripts, and I know that a lot of our listeners love the beautiful art that accompanies illuminated manuscripts. And so maybe they've seen some of these manuscripts already, but I want to dive into a collection of manuscripts you've spent a lot of time with. And that's the collection of of Alamire, and we'll talk about who he is in a moment. But could you just tell me a little bit of what this collection is and what it looks like?
Yeah, sure. So the Alamire collection is a group of over 60 really stunning manuscripts that preserve late 15th century and early 16th century music. So for a period of about 35 years, from around 1500 to 1535, scribes of the chapels of the Burgundian Habsburg court produced a group of 49 complete manuscripts and about 12 fragments under the supervision of a scribe named Alamire. And the Burgundian Habsburg courts were located in Brussels and Mechelen, which is in present-day Belgium. And the courts were governed by Philip the Fair, his sister Margaret of Austria, and Philip's son, Archduke Charles. Now, these manuscripts have interested scholars for a long time, already in the 19th century, but starting in the 1960s, musicologists by the name of Herbert Kellman started recognizing these manuscripts as a group. And the majority are highly decorated, really beautiful. They have elaborate borders, calligraphed initials, illuminated initials, also individual illuminations, coats of arms, and donor portraits. So we can recognize that all these manuscripts followed a certain style and were created by the same set of people. And that decoration is in a certain style known as the Ghent Bruges style. Simon Benning is a well-known master illustrator of this style. And so these were luxury manuscripts where the visual result was just as important as the music itself being copied. And these manuscripts were produced right before the transition to the printing press. So they're really the apex or the pinnacle of hand-copied parchment manuscripts.
And when I look at the borders, I mean, for example, I love the kind of yellowish borders that have a sort of catalog of flora locally, or, there are some devotional images, and there are also some kind of weird looking clownish guys. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the individual elements?
There's a real mixture. These are not just sacred, pious images. We do have plenty of those. There's plenty of illuminations of the Virgin Mary, some of the Blessed Sacrament, but there's also a lot of fun medieval faces, jokers, lots of different birds and animals, just to make it fun. We don't know exactly why. We have pictures of jokers, for instance, in sacred music, in the middle of a mass, or what we call drolleries, grotesques. But that was the style. So for us as modern viewers, we might say, wow, that looks really out of context for sacred music manuscript. But that's really a distinguishing feature of this scribes and the style of illumination.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about the music that's in these in a moment, but can you tell us a little bit about the cultural context that brought such richness about? Obviously, we're dealing with a royal court, but this is not only the combination of so much money for patronage, but also kind of a unique collection of talent, wasn't it?
The 15th and 16th centuries were really a time of exceptional artistic and cultural life in the Low Countries. It's sometimes called the Golden Age. Flanders at the time was the most densely populated area north of the Alps. So they had tremendous economic prosperity, cities like Bruges and Ghent. And this economic flourishing was accompanied by an array of patronage and flourishing of the arts. So in architecture, tapestry weaving, painting, the Flemish primitives, of course, and the illumination of books of hours. And these were happening in multiple circles, in urban circles, in courtly circles, and also in ecclesiastical circles.
Yeah, and something that might be more common to our listeners are the private devotional books of hours, right? And that's a sort of different genre from what we're dealing with here, but those are some of the most stunning examples of books ever produced.
And the same illuminators worked on books of hours as would have worked on the Alamire manuscripts.
Right. Okay, so this raises the question, who was Alamire?
Well, he was a music scribe and a copyist. He supervised a school of scribes or a workshop of scribes. But he's also one of the most important figures in music history in the early 16th century. His real name was Petrus Imhoff or Petrus van den Hove. So Alamire is a pseudonym. It's based on the solfege syllables for the pitch A and the various hexachords. So la, mi, re. So a, la, mi, re. And the earliest record we have is from a confraternity register in the Netherlands. It's the famous Confraternity of Our Lady in 's-Hertogenbosch. And he appears in the late 1490s. And we learned there that he's from Nuremberg. And there was a prominent Imhoff family in Nuremberg who were merchants and would have had contacts with the Low Countries through trade. So it's quite probable that he was part of that family, somehow connected with them. And then the confraternity payment records his first his first payments for copying of music books. And a few years later, we find him in Antwerp, which is in present-day Belgium, copying a book of motets and magnificats for the Collegiate Church of Our Lady there. And he'd continue copying for that church in Antwerp while he worked for the Burgundian Habsburg court. So by 1503, he's at the court of Philip the Fair, who was the ruler of the Burgundian Habsburg Netherlands, and he was copying music books for him. He was a court scribe and also the music librarian for the court chapel, and he probably also sang as well. And then he continued to be employed by Philip's son, Charles, from 1508 to 1517, and this Charles would later become the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. So Alamire was a really interesting and enterprising person. He managed the School of Scribes, as I mentioned, that produced more than 60 manuscripts that are part of the Alamire collection. But in addition to being a music calligrapher, he was also a seller of instruments as well as a composer himself. But perhaps the most interesting thing about his life is that he was a diplomat and perhaps even a spy. So musicians at that time were very itinerant. They were always traveling around from court to court. So there's nothing unusual about that. If you want to send documents with a musician, it's a great cover. So he was producing luxury manuscripts for some of the most influential state and church leaders of his time, and then having to visit them to make deliveries of the manuscripts. So we actually have some letters that survive from 1515 to 1518 that Alamire wrote to King Henry VIII of England that concern the exiled Duke of Suffolk, Richard de la Pole, who was living in France at the time. And Alamire had been visiting some of his people that Richard was consorting with. And so he may have been reporting on his actions under the direction of the crown. He also served as a courier for the Secretary of Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, who had protected Martin Luther from the Holy Roman Emperor and from the Pope. And he also carried letters for Erasmus. And we have some really interesting remarks by Erasmus on Alamire. Evidently, Alamire didn't always deliver his letters in a timely fashion. Erasmus was complaining about how he was responding to a letter now that was almost 2 years old. Erasmus told one of his friends that he found Alamire to be a rather amusing person. But he said, if you want your letters to be preserved, then Alamire is the person. But if you want them to be delivered in a timely manner, then you better entrust them to someone else. So he really had a really very interesting life and career, mixing in these various circles with music and politics.
You're listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska, and the director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is Dr. Emily Thelen, a musicologist who heads up the Office of Mission Integration at St. Norbert's College in Wisconsin, alongside her continued scholarly work and teaching in Renaissance music from the Low Countries. Can we get into these confraternities? I think this is a really foreign idea to most Americans. We think about the Confraternity of the Sacred Heart or something, and we think about people who produce pious devotional books and then old ladies sitting around in a church basement or something. But that was a very different scene. What role did confraternities play in the spiritual and social and economic structures of the Low Countries during this time?
Yeah, so like you said, we may think of a confraternity as like the Our Lady of the Rosary or the Rosary Sodality Society or something like that, which is essentially the same thing. But at the time in the Middle Ages, they were almost functioned like guilds. In fact, some artisan guilds then became confraternities. So they were part of the civic fabric. So they weren't just in the religious sphere only. They mixed their religious devotion with perhaps their particular trade, like an artisan or a wood carver. And they would have a particular saint that they would be devoted to, who would often be the patron saint of their particular trade or craft. And there were many that were quite prestigious, like the Confraternity of Our Lady in Sertogenbosch. A lot of wealthy people. It was kind of like the place to be if you were part of society. Right at the beginning of the 16th century, we also start to see confraternities that emerge that are for the average lay person. They were important for poor people who would want to have masses said for them after they died, but who couldn't necessarily afford to endow their own mass or liturgical services to be said after they died. But if they enrolled in this confraternity, then they would enjoy the spiritual benefits as well as the social benefits of the confraternity.
Yeah. So in a way, from the kind of glass half full perspective, it's a beautiful expression of the Catholic culture meeting economics and way of life. But from the more cynical side, it might be that, there was a sort of pious veneer to something that was more materially motivated.
Mhm. But at the same time, I think, when you see the extent to which people went to decorate their own chapels. So a lot of the confraternities would have a side altar or a side chapel in some of these bigger churches. And people left their inheritance to certain foundations, to certain masses to be said for the confraternity. So there was a real devotion that went on as well. But the society wasn't separated into the kind of strong divide that we have now in American culture between secular and sacred.
Right. So let's get back to this collection of manuscripts. What is the repertoire that they preserve, and how much of that repertoire is sacred music?
So there's over 600 different works in total in the collection. Many of these are repeated, so there's actually more than 100, or actually more than 850 pieces copied in total. So it's huge. The overwhelming majority is sacred music or liturgical or devotional context, and most of that are actually mass cycles. So settings of the ordinary, the parts of the mass that would be sung every time the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. And the court traveled with its chapel, and so they would need lots of different masses to be sung every different day. And having this beautiful, richly illuminated manuscript in the center of your chapel was kind of a way to show off, especially if you were traveling. So there are over 180 different masses, and then some about maybe 25 mass movements that aren't complete for a whole cycle. In addition to the masses, there are also motets. We have about 180 motets, and then there's also some secular music, so chanson and other secular songs in Dutch. And then one manuscript has just Magnificats, that's Jena 34. And then another manuscript, Munich 34, has just Salve Regina setting. So those two are unique in setting just those two types of pieces. But those two pieces are important they show the unpopularity of the evening services in the Low Countries that were said in addition to the daily mass. So that in the confraternities that we were talking about, a lot of them would sponsor what was called a lof service. Lof, which just means praise in Dutch, was sometimes called a salve service. It was extremely popular in the Low Countries, and those were often celebrated with polyphony. It didn't have a fixed structure, but there were Marian prayers, and so the Salve Regina would have been perfect for that. And then Vespers was also celebrated not just by the collegiate churches, but by parishes and confraternities as well. So that explains why we would have two manuscripts just with those types of liturgical settings. For the most part, the manuscripts are not liturgically themed. We do have two, aside from the Magnificat and the Salve Regina, there are two exceptions. One example is the Acco Codex. That was commissioned by Pompeius Acco. He was the caretaker of the chapel in Amsterdam. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was a pilgrimage site in honor of the Blessed Sacrament. So the story about how that became a pilgrimage site is kind of interesting. In the mid-14th century, I think around 1345, someone had just received the viaticum, and he was very sick and received the last rites, but then he threw up into the fireplace, and he threw up the sacred host, but yet the host remained untouched by the fire. And so this was considered a miracle, and pilgrims came from all over the place. It became a holy chapel then, and then Acco was the warden for this chapel. And so he commissioned a manuscript for the confraternity there, and that music has music that's devoted to the Blessed Sacrament. So 7 motets and 2 masses that could be sung for Corpus Christi, and then it has a variety of other pieces as well, but it does have a large thematic component to it.
It's so funny sometimes being Catholic and the things that take center place in our devotional life.
I know.
It's stories like that. I think that maybe perhaps moms of toddlers can especially appreciate.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the masses that are a part of this collection. Are they cantus firmus masses, parody masses? What kind of masses, melodies do they use?
Yeah, so a lot of the masses I would say maybe most were based on secular models, and in either cantus firmus or parody masses. Many were on the famous Alamire tune, the Armed Man.
Can you talk about that tune for a moment?
Well, it was a famous French chanson that a lot of composers used as the foundational melody. So they would take this melody and put it in the tenor and then build the other voices around it. And it was quite controversial because people recognize in some of the masses, the way they're set, you can actually recognize the sacred tune. So even back in the 15th century, there were complaints about popular music encroaching on church music. So there was lots of masses that didn't have a specific occasion, like these ones that were based on secular models. They could be used for any mass. But then there were some that were written for a specific feast, like Easter or Christmas or the Assumption. Or there are many that are for specific saints, like Saint John the Baptist, or Saint Anna. But there are also plenty of Marian, kind of more generic Marian masses that could have been used for any of the Marian feasts. And then we do have some requiem that weren't just for funerals, but again, as part of the confraternity culture, there were frequent memorial masses that were endowed by members of the confraternity. And so there was definitely a need for masses that could be sung in that context as well.
I'm always struck by, just coming back again to the confraternities and what you mentioned about requiems, in a time when life expectancy was so much lower, and just kind of the feeling that death really was possible at almost any moment, there's a reality that sets in that, yes, can drive fear, but also really connected people to their faith and made it just so much more important to live a faithful life rather than, the illusion of that we're going to live forever or can
Mhm.
overcome everything through science and medicine.
Yeah, there was a real concern for the afterlife and for having people to pray for you, to get you out of purgatory. And so people before they even died would set up foundations and donate money for a mass to be said at a certain time each month or biannually or quarterly. And they would even pay for people to sing at these masses, polyphony, and not only did the priest stipend, but to have people there to ring the bells. And so they were planning for it. Several composers wrote music to be sung at their deathbed. And that's a big reason why these confraternities were, after they became in the early 16th century, open to everyone without having to pay heavy dues. They were very important. People wanted to receive those spiritual benefits, to have people to pray for them because they couldn't afford to endow their own foundations for after they died.
Right. So let's speak about coming back to the collection. Which composers are in this collection?
Yeah, so there's actually 55 different composers that are represented by at least one piece, but the collection it really plays a crucial role in the dissemination of the composers of the Josquin generation. By far, the most well-represented composer is Pierre de la Rue. He's not as well known as Josquin, for instance, but he was the court composer of the Burgundian Habsburg court. He was very well liked by Margaret of Austria. So he has the most number of pieces. All but one of his 31 masses of his attributed masses are found in the complex. And 5 of the manuscripts contain only his music, but he did serve the chapel for 25 years, so that makes sense. And then Josquin is the next composer who has the most amount of music. About 75% of his masses are represented, less of his motets, just a small fraction of them. But then we also have people like Matthias Pipolare, Alexander Agricola, Heinrich Isaac, Johannes Ockeghem, who would have been recently deceased at the time. Most of his pieces are found in the famous Kiji Codex, which was copied shortly after his death. So that actually contains almost his whole sacred output. Jacob Obrecht, Johannes Prioris. There's also some French composers, Fevin and Mouton. And then actually a very large number of the pieces are anonymous. We actually have 175 pieces with unidentified composers. And that doesn't mean that they're any less valuable, but the anonymity was just a common feature of the music of those days. And of the composers that we do know, many worked for the Burgundian Habsburg court, some for the French court, and some worked in Italy. And then we have a lot of minor composers that we wouldn't have known that they existed at all, but for their representation in the Alamire manuscripts.
So can you tell us how they're laid out on the page? Are they part books? Are they having all the parts on one page? Who was singing from these manuscripts?
Yeah, so there's 2 different formats. There's the choir book format, and then there's the part book format. So with the part book format, it says it sounds each part, usually 4 or 5 voices, would have its own separate book, and the book would contain only their part. The choir book format has all of the individual voices in the same book, but each line is written separately. So it's different from modern music, which has all the voices stacked on top of each other in time with the music. You would maybe see on the left hand, if you're at an opening folio, on the left hand, you would see the superiorus, the highest voice. On the right hand side, you would see the next highest voice, maybe the countertenor. And then on the bottom lower left, you might see the tenor. And on the bottom right, you would see the bass. And generally, each voice, the scribes would line it up so that each voice part would be able to turn the page at the same time. But there was very few signs for them to know, okay, we're going to start from this point. Sometimes there was points of congruence where they could pick up, but there were no bar lines or measures or anything for the singers to say, and we're going to start halfway through. They're very large, so the singers would have all sung off of one copy, the single manuscript, and it would have been put up on a lectern, and they could have all stood between 4 and 8 singers would stand around this one copy and all read from it at the same time. The They're fairly large, on average, maybe about 22, 23 inches by 15 or 16 inches. And then there's some that are smaller and some that are so big that they require multiple people to carry it.
So the visual elements and the richness of it were intended for the patrons, right? But the patrons expressed their wealth in a way by giving something really nice to their other servants.
Yeah. Well, they're just as much impressive for their visual component as for the repertoire that they preserve. But some people tend to think, well, these were just presentation copies, and it doesn't really matter. And so the scribes didn't bother to fix errors, and that may be true. There are maybe some errors that the scribes would overlook because it would be difficult for the overall look of the page to fix. Sometimes we do see replacement pages where they've had to go back through and there were too many errors and they replaced the whole page. So there was a real concern for having accuracy, and they were making sure that all the singers would be able to be lined up with their music for the page turns. They were careful about how they use certain ligatures, for instance. Sometimes they didn't always plan that out well, and there'd have to be an extra stave or an extra a line, and you have to go find your music on a different line. But for the most part, they valued both the repertoire, the music, and its visual presentation.
It's really interesting to me too, and I don't know if you can maybe fill in some musicological clues about this, but just the conception for the composer of holding in the mind and composing the individual parts. What do you think that was experienced as for the composer?
Well, I think they thought of counterpoint. It was part of their musical language to have a tenor line and then to be able to fill in with various intervals around that. They thought of in points of imitation. So yeah, it's a different way of looking at the music, as far as, not having all the voices together in their minds. They didn't have a problem knowing
Right.
what it was going to sound, because it was a much more oral culture anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. They just seem so much more capable of holding so much more in their minds simultaneously than, a modern composer who, sometimes sits down at Muse score or Dorico, and no longer finale, of course, but and has to hear everything simultaneously.
They could sing directly off these manuscripts. Like in most cases, most modern singers will have to make additions and put it into this. So this music is in mensural notation, and you can read off of it. There's actually several groups that specialize in singing from the original sources, and it's possible for most of these manuscripts. Or sometimes there's little puzzles or little riddles they would leave that you have to work out, like how to expand a certain voice, or you might have to sing it backwards, or there's a certain way you'd have to work out a canon that wouldn't be immediate. But the singers, this is what they sang from. This was their music, and it was no problem for them to be able to hear the other voice parts and to follow on their line and keep track of where they were, even if they couldn't see the other lines of music.
Right. Let's talk about a particular manuscript, Brussels 215, 216. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is a manuscript I worked on in particular. We call it Brussels 215, 216 just because that's where it's housed. It's housed in the Brussels Royal Library, and its shelf mark is 215, 216 because it has both polyphony and chant. So there's some question of whether the two sections were always together, if they were put together at a later point in time, which is why it has the two numbers. But all of this music is connected to a single theme, a single liturgical devotion. So it's really unique in that regard. I mentioned the Akko Codex earlier that has part of its music liturgically themed, and then we have the two manuscripts that are themed by genre. But this is the only one that is entirely devoted to a single theme, and that is of the seven sorrows of the Virgin. So it has two polyphonic masses, one by Pierre de la Rue and one is anonymous. And then it has Josquin's Stabat Mater and a seven-voice motet by Pipalare, which is quite unusual for the time. There were very few seven-voice motets. And this motet obviously is chosen for the seven sorrows. So each voice is labeled as a sorrow in the manuscript itself, from Primus, first dolor, all the way to Septimus dolor. And that's written in red in each of the voice parts. And that motet also is accompanied by an illumination of Our Lady of Sorrows with 7 radial swords piercing her heart. So that was the iconography that had developed at the time. And then this manuscript also has plain chant. So the Feast of the Seven Sorrows was new in the beginning of the 16th century, and Philip the Fair's court actually helped to develop the music and the liturgy for it. They held a competition to develop new texts and music for the feast, and the plain chant that is in the manuscript was probably an entry in that competition. And the manuscript was owned by Charles de Clercq, who was a treasurer for the court. So there's a connection not only with the devotion to the court, but also to the manuscript's owner. And he probably had a personal devotion to the Seven Sorrows as well. He also owned a Book of Hours with Seven Sorrows illumination. And he was married 3 times. His first 2 wives died in childbirth, and his first wife is buried in a chapel dedicated to the Seven Sorrows. So it appears that he had a personal devotion to the Seven Sorrows, as well as being connected to the court that was heavily involved in promoting it.
Where can people find these manuscripts online? I'm sure they're itching to see them now that you've described them for them.
Yeah, so the Alamire Foundation, which is the International Center for the Study of Music in the Low Countries, has worked on a project to digitize all the manuscripts that are now held in the Brussels Royal Library and the Vatican, and they've collated that with other images that had already been taken by their holding institutions, and they've made a database called the Integrated Database for Early Music. So it's IDEM, IDEM database.org. And there you can see all of the Alamire manuscripts in detail, as well as other manuscripts that the foundation has digitized. And then the Alamire Foundation is also doing a facsimile series, some high quality reproductions of some of these manuscripts. And that is called the Leuven Library of Facsimile series. And so you can find hard copy reproductions along with studies of some of the manuscripts. There's about 4 or 5 volumes out in that series so far.
Great. And your book is one of those in that series?
Yeah, so Brussels 215, 216 is published in facsimile along with my study.
Great. So we'll link to those things in our show notes page and along with that to your book. And I'm so grateful that you were able to explain this collection to us, Emily. It's truly a treasure for the church, a feast for the eyes and the soul.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.